Some towns are remembered for how quickly they grew, others for how suddenly they collapsed. But there is a quieter category that history rarely names. Towns that were built for growth, prepared for crowds, and then waited. They were mapped, they were planned, they were announced as inevitable, and then nothing happened. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, forgotten places, and the long-term consequences of historical decisions, consider liking the video and subscribing. It quietly supports the continuation of stories like this. This is not a story about ghost towns that died. It is about boomtowns that never became anything at all. Across the United States, gold discoveries triggered expectations long before reality arrived. Investors moved first. Surveyors followed. Streets were drawn on paper before people ever walked them. According to historical records, these towns were not failures in the traditional sense. They were never tested long enough to fail. Growth was expected, prepared for, and then indefinitely postponed. The buildings stood waiting. The streets remained empty. The future stayed theoretical. The question is not why these towns collapsed. The question is what happens when a place is built for a moment that never comes. The idea of the boomtown often arrives before the town itself. During the gold rush era, discovery created more than excitement. It created projection. Investors, land speculators, and planners imagined not just extraction, but permanence. According to contemporary accounts, towns were laid out with confidence that population growth was inevitable. Grid systems were drawn to accommodate thousands. Public buildings were planned for institutions that did not yet exist. This confidence was not irrational. It was based on patterns that had worked elsewhere. Gold had created cities before. Railroads had followed. Commerce had filled the gaps. But the idea of a boomtown depended on timing. Gold needed to be rich enough. Access needed to be fast enough. Momentum needed to arrive early. In these forgotten boomtowns, preparation outpaced reality. The gold was present, but limited. The location was promising, but distant. The infrastructure was planned, but incomplete. Contemporary accounts suggest that people arrived cautiously, expecting others to follow. But without visible crowds, commitment remained low. Businesses delayed opening. Families hesitated to settle. Everyone waited for confirmation. Growth became conditional, dependent not on gold itself, but on the arrival of others. And as time passed, that confirmation never came. The boomtown existed fully formed in expectation, but only partially in reality. It stood in a state of readiness, prepared for a future that remained hypothetical. In boomtowns that never took off, the first arrivals were rarely settlers in the traditional sense. They came early, but not decisively. According to historical records, the initial population of these towns was often made up of speculators, surveyors, and temporary workers rather than families or long-term residents. Their presence was cautious, calculated, and provisional. Land was claimed. Lots were purchased, but houses were not always built. People arrived to position themselves for growth, not to create it. They expected others to follow: miners, merchants, transport links, and capital. Their role was not to stay, but to be ready. This shaped the atmosphere of these towns from the beginning. Streets existed without traffic. Buildings stood unfinished or unopened. Supplies arrived in anticipation rather than response. Contemporary accounts suggest that many early arrivals delayed full commitment. Businesses waited to see foot traffic before opening permanently. Families postponed relocation until schools and services appeared. Workers stayed seasonally, leaving between extraction cycles. Everyone acted rationally and collectively. That rationality stalled momentum. No group was willing to move first in a way that created permanence. Each waited for confirmation from the others. Growth became a shared expectation without a driver. The town existed, but lightly. Present, but incomplete. This early hesitation mattered more than any later obstacle. Without a decisive first wave willing to absorb risk, the conditions necessary for acceleration never materialized. The boomtown was inhabited, but not inhabited enough. Momentum requires imbalance. In successful boomtowns, people arrive faster than infrastructure can support them. Shortages appear, prices rise, activity accelerates. The discomfort of growth becomes proof that growth is happening. In these towns, that imbalance never occurred. According to historical records, gold extraction progressed slowly and inconsistently. Yields were enough to justify continued work, but not enough to create urgency. There was no rush to claim land before it disappeared, because land remained available. This removed pressure. Without pressure, speculation cooled. Without scarcity, prices stabilized early. Without visible strain, there was no signal that opportunity was fleeting. Contemporary accounts describe a persistent sense of anticipation without confirmation. People waited for the next announcement, the next discovery, the next group of arrivals that would tip the balance. But momentum depends on timing as much as scale. Rail connections were delayed or rerouted. Investment shifted toward regions already showing rapid growth. Government attention followed population density, not expectation. The boomtowns were always close, but never close enough. Later historical analysis indicates that once the early window for acceleration passed, recovery became unlikely. Growth delayed is not the same as growth denied. But in boomtowns, delay often functions as denial. As months became years, expectation thinned. Plans were revised downward. Infrastructure remained partial. The future stopped feeling imminent. The towns did not fail because something went wrong. They failed because nothing happened fast enough. And once that moment passed, it could not be recreated. In towns that never took off, waiting was not neutral. It created winners, just not the ones the towns were built for. According to historical records, land speculators and early claim holders often benefited most from delay. By arriving early and committing minimally, they preserved optionality. If growth arrived, they would profit. If it did not, their losses remained limited. Risk was shifted downward. Local workers, small merchants, and service providers bore the cost of uncertainty. They stocked supplies for customers who never came. They built structures that stayed empty. They extended credit into a future that remained hypothetical. Contemporary accounts suggest that many small businesses existed in a state of perpetual readiness. Stores opened irregularly. Services were offered seasonally. Employment remained informal and unstable. Meanwhile, distant investors faced no such pressure. Their capital waited comfortably elsewhere. Their decisions could be revised without consequence. The town itself absorbed the cost of delay, installed activity, idle infrastructure, and eroding confidence. Waiting became a strategy. Those who could afford to wait without committing gained flexibility. Those who needed momentum to survive lost it slowly. The boomtowns promised protected early positions, but offered little to those who depended on realization rather than speculation. The town existed to serve an expectation, but expectation did not serve the town. As time passed, the imbalance deepened. Profits, when they existed, were extracted lightly. Losses accumulated locally. The boomtown became a holding pattern that benefited mobility over presence. And once it became clear that waiting was safer than acting, growth had already lost its chance. The cost of a boomtown that never takes off is difficult to measure. There is no collapse to mark the moment, no abandonment to document the end. Instead, cost appears as absence. According to later historical analysis, these towns incurred long-term losses not through failure, but through underuse. Infrastructure built for expansion remained partially idle. Land designated for development produced no return. Human effort dissipated without outcome. The towns paid for growth in advance and never collected on it. Schools were planned but never filled. Public buildings were constructed for institutions that never formed. Roads connected places that no longer mattered. This produced a distinct kind of inefficiency. Resources were neither fully consumed nor fully preserved. They existed in a state of suspension, maintained just enough to justify hope, but never enough to create momentum. Contemporary accounts describe a slow recalibration. Ambitions were lowered gradually. Plans were revised quietly. The idea of the boomtown did not end, it thinned. People adapted to partial use. Partial success, partial futures. This cost was cumulative. Years spent waiting could not be reclaimed. Energy invested without outcome reduced the willingness to try again. Once the town accepted that growth might never arrive, the psychological cost became fixed. The boomtown did not die, but it never truly began, and that unrealized beginning became its defining feature. What remained in boomtowns that never took off was not ruin, but excess. Streets were wider than necessary. Parcels were larger than demand required. Buildings stood finished, but underused. According to historical records, many of these towns retained a physical scale that never matched their population. The layout assumed arrival, crowds, traffic, institutions that never materialized. This mismatch shaped daily life. Empty storefronts were not signs of decline, but of anticipation. Public spaces existed without events. Housing stood available without occupants. The town looked prepared, but felt unfinished. Contemporary accounts suggest that residents became accustomed to this imbalance. They learned to navigate spaces built for more people than existed. Silence replaced congestion. Familiarity replaced urgency. The built environment became a constant reminder of what had been expected. Unlike ghost towns, these places did not feel abandoned. They felt paused, maintained, but waiting, functional, but incomplete. What remained most clearly was the structure of intention. Every road, plot, and building encoded a future that had once been assumed. Even as expectations faded, the physical form persisted, reinforcing the idea that growth might still arrive. The town lived inside a blueprint for something larger than itself, and as long as that blueprint remained visible, it shaped how people understood their present. Historically, these towns occupy an uncomfortable category. They were not successful enough to celebrate, not failed enough to abandon. Later historical analysis indicates that such places challenged the way progress is usually measured. They did not advance, but they did not retreat. They existed in a prolonged middle state, defined by readiness rather than achievement. This reveals a deeper pattern in economic history. Expectation often precedes evidence. Planning often outpaces reality. When those two drift too far apart, the result is not collapse, but stagnation. Boomtowns that never boomed expose the cost of building around assumption instead of confirmation. They show how belief in inevitability can delay adaptation, and how preparation can become a substitute for action. These towns were built not on failure, but on confidence. Confidence that gold would last. Confidence that people would follow. Confidence that growth was automatic. When that confidence proved misplaced, there was no clear response. The system had no mechanism for reversing expectation, only for waiting it out. As a result, these towns became case studies in deferred decision-making. They demonstrate how places can persist for decades without ever redefining themselves. They are not remembered for what they achieved. They are remembered, if at all, for what they were ready to become. Waiting changes how people think. In boomtowns that never took off, waiting was not temporary. It became a condition. According to contemporary accounts, Residents adjusted their expectations not all at once, but gradually, as each anticipated milestone failed to arrive. First, they waited for more people, then for investment, then for confirmation that the wait itself made sense. This created a specific psychological pattern. People avoided irreversible decisions. Businesses hesitated to expand. Families delayed long-term commitments. Life was organized around the idea that the real beginning was still ahead. Later historical analysis suggests that prolonged anticipation narrows ambition. When action is constantly postponed in favor of readiness, risk-taking declines. The future remains abstract, and the present becomes provisional. The town learns to exist in draft form. Residents develop routines that assume change without requiring it. Repairs are temporary. Plans are conditional. Hope is maintained, but carefully rationed. Over time, this mindset becomes self-sustaining. The absence of growth justifies further waiting. The longer nothing happens, the harder it becomes to imagine decisive movement in any direction. The boomtown does not experience disappointment in a single moment. It experiences normalization. Waiting stops feeling like a delay and starts feeling like stability. And once waiting is stable, urgency disappears. The town is no longer preparing for growth. It is preparing to continue waiting. The long-term consequences of boomtowns that never boomed are subtle but persistent. According to historical records, many of these towns survived into later decades with reduced populations and limited economic diversity. They did not collapse, but they did not renew. The defining feature became continuity without progress. Infrastructure aged slowly. Public services adapted to lower demand. Schools merged or downsized. The town's footprint remained larger than its function. This imbalance shaped regional development. Because these towns never experienced dramatic failure, they rarely attracted intervention. There was no crisis to resolve, no urgency to address stagnation. Policy and investment favoured places with clearer trajectories, either growth or decline. The boomtowns remained in between. Later historical analysis indicates that this in-between status can persist for generations. Children grow up accustomed to limited opportunity. Departure becomes normalized. Those who stay inherit not ambition, but maintenance. The cost is cumulative. Years of deferred decisions reduce the capacity for transformation. Even when new opportunities appear, the institutional and psychological readiness to act has weakened. The town continues to function, but it does not redefine itself. Its long-term consequence is not disappearance, but permanence without direction, a place shaped by an event that never fully occurred. Boomtowns that never boomed reveal a failure that does not look like failure. They were not destroyed by disaster. They were not abandoned in panic. They were not erased from the map. They were built and then left waiting. These towns invested in a future before that future proved itself. Streets were drawn. Land was divided. Structures were raised in anticipation of people who never arrived. According to historical records, nothing went wrong in the conventional sense. Gold existed. Work happened. Plans were reasonable based on what was known at the time. What was missing was momentum. Growth did not arrive fast enough to justify confidence. Confirmation did not come in time to sustain belief. And once the moment for acceleration passed, it could not be recreated. These towns did not collapse. They normalized waiting. They adapted to partial use, incomplete fulfillment, and deferred purpose. Over time, readiness replaced ambition. Maintenance replaced expansion. They survived, but survival was never the goal. The boomtown promised transformation. What followed was persistence without direction. And that raises a final question. If a town prepares for growth that never comes, if it waits long enough for a future that remains hypothetical, at what point does readiness itself become the past?